I want to start by just giving a bit of background as to precisely who I am and how it is I came to produce this paper. Yeah, there we are. I, once upon a time, used to be the Chief of Staff of the Transport Workers Union of Australia in about 2012. And thereabouts, I had the opportunity to go on secondment to a think tank by the name of Capita, in which I was able to produce, I guess, two papers. One which was far more geared towards economics, but then the follow-up paper was this one, which I'm about to show you some of the research from now, which is very much geared towards politics and very much geared towards answering a question of essentially who is left today, and that is who is a follower and a practitioner of progressive tradition. The reason I got interested in this was really because of this chart, and because as a person who obviously has quite a lot of knowledge in politics and obviously has a big care for the movement, seeing the way in which the progressive share of the total electorate has fluctuated between 1993 and 2013 prompted a whole series of inquiries and sort of questions about precisely how are we changing, and to the extent to which the left is changing in Australia, to what extent is that aligned with how the left is changing elsewhere. Now obviously 1993 remains one of the best election victories the left has won, certainly of the 8 elections that are listed here, other than the 2007 as our most convincing victory. And you can see in 2007 we recover our share of the electorate to about 52%, and then we once more slump to a decline. Not necessarily our worst result in 2013, but not far from our worst result, which was 1996. Now, obviously, the left victories and the left defeats were both happened. The left's greatest victories and the left's greatest defeats both delivered by these two men. And the theory that I have, and the theory that I've been thinking about for a while, is the way in which Keating won and the way in which Rudd won were radically different from each other. And that if you were to treat the sort of political base that sustained the Keating government, and assuming that it is the same base that sustained the Rudd government, you'd be making a mistake. Indeed, the people who supported Paul Keating were very, very different to the people who supported Kevin Rudd. And what I wanted to do is be able to identify precisely who are those people, to what degree have they changed their voting preference, and what precisely is motivating them. The starting point is really, I want to explain the technique that I've used to be able to show you the data that I'm showing you. I've used Australian election study data, which is a survey series conducted every year by the Australian National University. They've done it every year since 1967, and they've done it in electronic format in every year since 1987. And what I've done is I've essentially split the election into two, a progressive end and a conservative end. And in my analysis, the progressive poll is measured primarily through the vote of the Australian Labor Party, and the conservative poll is obviously voted through the vote of the Liberal National Coalition. But any minor party that has won significant support between 1993 and 2013, that is the Australian Democrats, One Nation and the Australian Greens, have had their vote split between the progressive and conservative polls according to the average percentage of their first preference vote distributed to either of the ALP or the LNP in the first party, the lower house two-party preferred count. This is similar to a two-party preferred, but not necessarily exactly. Now, obviously, the data I'm going to be showing you is going to be showing you areas of overperformance and underperformance. That is, certain demographies in which the left's done better and certain demographies in which the left's done weaker. Bear in mind that between 1993 and 2013, they were years of decline. As if we got less votes in 2013 than we did in 1993, then hence overperformance and underperformance is relative. That means if we've declined at 10 points in the population in general, but we've only declined 5 points amongst a certain demography, in that certain demography we've overperformed about by 5 points. Now, what I've then done is then looked at the demographies associated with each of these sociological trends. And I've been able to sort of show pretty much if you take each of these sort of trends and look at the demographies that are most affected by them, how have these trends changed those votes. So I want to get straight underway by going immediately to class and the fading relevance of class. Now, I'll be absolutely clear. Once upon a time, every single election was analysed according to class. That is, working class versus upper class, middle class versus working class. I'll be very clear, in the UK they still have a voting system and a voting method of analysis which is heavily class-centric. For those UK political bluffs, it's the A, B, C and DE type of voter classification system. But I want to be very clear about this. This is fading for us. Middle classdom is the sociological trend that is enveloping the mainstream. And by that I mean more and more Australians are starting to identify themselves as being middle-class voters, self-identified middle-class voters. And what you're also finding is as more and more people start to identify as middle-class voters, class as a way in which to start to understand voting blocks is fading. Here's what I mean. In 1993, 46% of Australians self-identified as middle class. That is, Australian voters in 1993, 46% of them said that they consider themselves to be middle class. You can see that is just a continuous upward trend. Indeed, I term middle class to be the new black. And the other thing which I'll be very, very clear about is that this is a consistent trend. Since 2004, I know more than half the population has considered itself to be middle class. And in 2010 and 2013, it came back essentially the exact same result, 57%. I want to show you now what's happening with the vote, with middle class votes. And this is precisely the type of quadrant chart that kind of visualises what I've been talking about. You're going to see a lot of these in the presentation that's coming. The point to understand here is the x-axis represents the extent to which they have changed their vote to the left or the right. And the y-axis denotes the extent to which they are increasing or decreasing their electorate share. And the size of the bubbles indicates the extent to which that is the comparative size of the voting bloc. And this is a thing which I think troubles quite a lot of people in the left, and it's the reason why I'm starting this one straight away, because if you kind of look what's happening, between 1993 and 2013, the left lost working class voters by about 5%. That's a pretty big shift. The reason why that hasn't been an absolute disaster is because the working class, people who self-identify as working class, are declining as well at a relatively sharp rate. As more and more people identify as middle class, the middle class label starts to mean less, and as a result you start to see it shifting towards the left. We are starting to pick up more votes from the middle class than we were necessarily from the working class. That's about 7 points to be precise. That has offset a lot of working class decline, but you can't read too much into that because, again, as more and more people start to identify as middle class, that becomes far less relevant. Personally, I was most amused by the fact that more upper class voters voted to the left in 2013 than they did in 1993, but let's be very honest, it's coming off a very small base. Now, here, this is the extent to which, and this is sort of a second table, which I probably should take some time explaining the format to you for, because you're going to see a lot of these ones as well. This here tells you the extent to which the lead that the left and the right has amongst its core demography has changed. So, for example, where it says middle-class conservative lead, that says that, again, if the right is winning 50% of the population, but 60% of the middle class, it's a 10-point middle-class lead. And here, if the working class, if the left's winning 58% of the working class and only 50% of the population, it's got a 9-point lead. The difference between those leads is what I call the vote gaps. This is a polarisation analysis for any of the stats freaks in the rooms. It's relatively stock standard way in which you can sort of compare how advantages align and also the extent to which various communities are polarised. What you can see is the class vote gap is dwindling quite radically. And from 20.55 to 8.31 in 2013. What you will see, which is also interesting, was that the most class-polarised elections of recent times were 1998 2007. So 1998 was the GST election, 2007 was a workforces election. It seems to be the case that when sort of questions of economic distribution and sort of wealth obligation are at the core of the election, class polarisation matters more than, say, for example, elections like the 2004 elections or incidentally 2013 elections. And that is itself probably the first finding in terms of the first trend. I want to move through the rest of them relatively quickly, given that we've now explained how these techniques work. I want to obviously talk about the ageing of the population. This is fundamental and is going to remain a fundamental factor that the left's going to have to deal with in the next 30 years. That is because by the middle of the century, nearly 1 in 4 Australians will be aged 65 years or older. And the proportion of Australians aged 85 years or older is likely to treble from about 1.2% to about 5%. Already this is creating in a whole bunch of different societies distributional conflicts of intergenerational equity. And for example, the debate we're having now about the appropriate age of the pension kind of fits within this sort of concept of precisely what obligations does one generation owe to another. Here's how the votes are tracking. What you're finding is, and this is somewhat troubling again for the left, is that the fastest growing demography, which is those who are 65 plus, are also decreasing their level of support for the left, and that's not being offset by younger voters who we generally have a very strong advantage in, but are rarely if ever a massive voting bloc in the electorate. This 25 to 30 to 44-year-old bloc is usually the age profile of your typical swing voter, and you can see that it hasn't necessarily shifted radically. It kind of denotes the fact that they tend to be the ones we've fought over quite a lot, but their electorate share is declining. In terms of how the age gap, or how, I guess, the generation gap goes, you'll find that, again, the last election was the most polarised election on the basis of age. The youngest voters had a diametrically different disposition towards the oldest voters. That in itself is not necessarily shocking, but what is interesting is that in the sort of the Abbott elections, both the 2010 and 2013, Abbott has increased his support significantly amongst older voters, far more than John Howard ever did as well. And indeed, older voters are somewhat the nucleus of the Abbott coalition, and are certainly the type of people who has given him sort of the magnitude of his victory the most. I want to talk now about the third sociological trend, which is the feminisation of the workforce. And this one here is somewhat historic. Obviously, you don't need me to tell you that the workforce is feminising. Take the workforce of 2013 and compare it to the workforce of 1974. No matter how you want to compare it, there's far more of a feminisation of the workforce. To be fair, as I'm sure everybody here would know, there's a lot more work to be done in terms of modernising all the systems associated with the workforce to account for the fact that particularly service working women are now sort of nucleus of the economy, and certainly in the labour market. But what is interesting is the historic voting preference, the one that totally underpinned a lot of 20th century politics, and not just in Australia, that is men vote left and women vote right, has changed. And it changed in 2001, which was the first election where a majority of female voters supported progressives. So have a look at that, and that's quite a radical shift given that's quite a binary position. There's been a 5-point shift from 1993 to 2013. What is even more interesting is gender polarisation. The most gender polarised election in which women voted left and men voted right was the 2010 Julia Gillard election, which incidentally remains the only election where one of the major party leaders was led by a woman. The last time we had a similar level of gender polarisation was 1993. But bear in mind, in 1993, the polarisation pattern was the complete opposite. Amongst progressives, in 1993, the left, amongst women, underperformed, and amongst conservatives, underperformed amongst men. 2010, that's quite a polarisation, and is a factor which I don't think we've properly worked through precisely what it means. I want to talk now about the fourth, the secularisation of civil society, and this is really the creeping influence of, I guess, atheist culture and atheist practice in society, as well as sort of, I guess, the corollary of that is the decline of theist practice and theist culture in the public square as well. By that I mean this. If you look at three different ways of looking at essentially faith in the electorate, you can see that that the amount of people who claim no religion has doubled since 1993. The amount of people who say that they've never attended a religious service has gone up by about 12 points between 1993 and 2013. The people who say that they attend service once a week has dropped by about 4 points. Politically, what are we seeing? Politically, we are seeing the left totally starting to own secular voters, and a big shift in the demography and the sociology of the left away from historically Roman Catholics towards secular voters. Roman Catholics are the number one group that the left has lost according to any demography, and they are still a very, very large part of the electorate. And indeed, anyone who has any interest in sort of left-wing history would know that Roman Catholic voters historically anchored the left for a very, very long time in the 20th century. It's, again, a very noticeable change in sociology of the left that we're seeing between 2013 and 1993. In terms of sort of the faith gap and the element of sort of secular, faith-based polarisation, it's consistently getting bigger. And you're consistently starting to see, again, as I said before, the left starting to own progressive secular voters. 13 points in 2010, 12 points in 2013. But you're also seeing the corollary of that, which is the conservative lead amongst religious voters is starting to build as well. And you're starting to see quite an element of polarisation between people who claim faith and people who claim no faith. This is what I term one of the more significant creeping thematics that we as a movement probably have to look at into the future as well. I want to talk now about, we'll move through these ones relatively quickly, the rise of the tertiary educated. There are a lot more people now with degrees than there were in 1993, and indeed, I think 1 in 3 Australians now claim some element of post-high school education, and about 1 in 4 claim that to be a tertiary or university-style education. In terms of what that means in respect of votes, people with education and with higher levels of university education are shifting aggressively to the left. People who have sort of no post-high school qualifications, who incidentally are a major block in the vote in the electorate and once upon a time comprised the majority of the left base, we are losing their votes and we're losing them fast. People with trade qualifications, we're also losing their votes as well. But to be fair, the amount of people who claim sort of no post-high school education are dropping fast as well. It's not necessarily clear that they're the absolute loser in all this sense from this change. In terms of sort of the education gaps, relatively stable. 2013 was the most sharply polarised in respect to sort of education. And you'll see that the Conservative lead amongst non-graduates shot up to 7.22 in that election. And indeed, that is quite a noticeable overperformance on the part of the right in the 2013 election. Public services, and this is for people who have members or otherwise association with the public sector obviously of the country. Historically, public servants tend to vote left and people in the private sector tend to vote right. That hasn't really changed. But what has changed is the amount of people who claim to be public servants. That's dropped. Self-employed, this is something which is a bit of a myth that we the left can't win self-employed people. They have been one of the fastest rising voter blocks for the left, but to be fair, they're coming off a very low base. Between 1993, we went from 28% of self-employed. In 2013, we won about 36% of self-employed persons. In terms of sort of the private sector, public sector gap, relatively stable, remains about roughly 10%, hasn't really changed radically. Cities, more Australians live in cities now than they did before. Vote patterns haven't radically changed, but the size of cities and the size of people who live in major cities has gone up. And so urbanisation isn't changing voting preference, but it's certainly changing the power of the different voting slots as well. The gap on the polarisation between people who live in cities and people who live in rural areas or villages, relatively stable, doesn't really blow out radically. The only time it sharply did sort of narrowed was in the 2007 election, where the right's lead in rural areas was cut quite dramatically. Traditional families, less and less people are living in them. More and more people are marrying, cohabitating before marriage. Women are having children later. Men tend to be older as fathers as well, to be fair. And the amount of people who are getting divorced has obviously risen from 1993 as well. You can see that here. Sort of voting preferences of people on the basis of marriage or de facto hasn't never really changed, but they're declining. People who have divorced or separated, they are more likely to be voting for the right. People who have never married are more likely to be voting for the left as well. So Linda, I'm going to end the first section of the presentation there and take questions. I know it was a lot of data. We went through it relatively quickly. So if anybody actually does want me to bring up another slide or return a slide to this, I'm more than happy to as well. But I'll pass back to you now for quick questions.
Thanks, Daniel. What I might do is open up to people in this office with me first, if you have any questions, while I figure out how to use the internet. Any questions in here?
Yeah, I've got a quick question. Particularly with the very significant gap. Can you hear me, sorry?
Yeah, I can.
Yep. Particularly with the very significant gap with Roman Catholics. How much is that influenced by the leader of the day, namely contrasting someone like Tony Abbott with, say, Julia Gillard, for example?
I'll bring that slide up. I think what you'll see is, I would say very little, because this is a trend that has sort of, firstly amongst religious voters, and incidentally the pattern is replicated amongst Roman Catholic voters, but the trend has been consistent since 1993 to 2013. Indeed, every single election, the left's overperformance and advantage amongst Roman, like historic overperformance and advantage amongst Roman Catholic voters has eroded. That's happened under every leader from Keating to Beazley to Latham to Rudd to Gillard. It's a trend that has been somewhat ignorant of who precisely the leader is. And other than sort of 07 when the entirety of the country essentially came back to the left, even sort of in the 07 election, the advantage amongst Roman Catholics was smaller than it was in the 1993 election. So I don't think this is a question which comes down to precisely the leadership. I think that the trend has sort of survived now 4 leaders from the left and in elections 2 leaders from the right. And so I don't think it's a question purely of leadership. Having said that, obviously good leadership can make a difference, but I think the trend is sort of fixed. I should have to be clear incidentally that this is a trend amongst Roman Catholic voters everywhere. So it's not like Australia is the only place where Roman Catholics are leaving the left. Same thing was noticeable in the Obama 12 election, less so in the 08 election. And the same thing has been a pattern in the UK election. So it's not necessarily, purely an Australian phenomenon. There's quite a lot of people who are internationally are so positive in the extent to which sort of the tensions now between sort of theist voters and atheist voters is going to be a point of social polarisation that's going to persist there for quite a while. So yeah, I should also make the point. Sorry again if I'm answering your question in far more detail than expected, but the greatest issue that divides the left here, both pro and negative, is gay marriage. It is the issue. I'm going to show you some of the data about that in a minute, but that issue perfectly captures, I think, and is perfectly a sign of the sort of, the type of societal conflicts that are going to be happening between theists and atheists over the next sort of 30 years, and I don't think it's going to be the last issue as well. So I hope that was I answered your question there. Sorry if it was a roundabout.
No, that was great. I do have one other quick question.
Yeah.
You mentioned that separated and divorced voters swing to the right. I was wondering if you had any speculation as to why that might be.
They're angry. I wouldn't necessarily write that view off. There's an element here, and this is somewhat where when you actually get the full paper, you'll see that I'll be talking about, which is the right wing is more and more organising using reactionary politics, and they're using the whole "the world is changing, let me get off" type of view. generally, particularly divorced men, particularly working class divorced men, there's been a huge amount of work done on this internationally, particularly in the US, about how particularly working class divorced no post high school qualification men are the most unstable force in world politics, and certainly in every advanced economy. And I think to a large degree you're starting to see that here. Now, I'm not certainly suggesting, therefore, that the moment you get divorced, you're automatically angry and reactionary. I know many divorced people who are very much happier once they are done that way. But I think that you've got to look at that in conjunction with the other trends. And I think that with that one, especially, I think once you break out divorce separated men by women, you actually start to see that more and more that is reflecting the experience of divorced men, not necessarily the experience of divorced women.
Have you, question from the back, have you tried to account for cross correlations between things like age and divorce and gender and divorce, those issues you just said that were overlapping?
I have, but sadly the Australian election study only just has a sample size. In 1983 was 2,000 and in 2013 was 4,000. The moment you get to that level of correlation and cross-tagging is the moment you get very high margins of error. So somewhat have done it, but I'm not necessarily suggesting that the data is reliable. I would suggest to everybody that we ought to donate to the Australian election study to allow them to expand their sample size to like 10,000, where you'll be able to get really meaningful cross-tabs. But the problem is with this sort of thing, I mean, I don't want to make this too stats and too quant-like, but you get a margin of error of about 8, which is way too high to be reliable. So sorry about that. Not really my fault.
If there's anyone on the line who would like to ask a question, I think you can press *1 on your keypad to unmute yourself to ask a question. So if there's anyone on the line who would like to ask a question, press *1 on your keypad and we'll try and see if you're unmuted so that you can ask it. Just give everyone a bit of time. It's *1 on your keypad. Okay. Is there anyone else in this room who wants to ask a question? I don't think I've noticed anyone on the line who wants to ask a question. If you tried to and you didn't get a chance, flick me an email while we're doing, or send me a text message, and I'll just try and ask your question for you. So if you tried to press *1 and we didn't take a question from you, flick me a text or an email and I'll ask your question for you. Daniel, back to you, mate.
Great. Okay, look, the second section is, I'm going to, it's a bit shorter, but it gets to the question really of why. And this
Sorry, Daniel.
Yep.
Changed your screen from the rise of tertiary educated slide?
Is it not changing?
No.
Alright, that's a problem. Oh yeah, there you go. Alright, I'll simply reload it. People say that now?
It's just loading. Yeah.
Yeah, good? Wonderful.
Yeah.
Alright. Yeah, you can see it move.
Just send me a text message or an email and I'll try and fix it for you. Thanks, Daniel.
Great. Okay, so we're just going to go now to the, really get into this sort of question as to why. What are the different sort of dispositions? What are the sort of things which are driving a lot of these sort of changes? And I'll be very clear about it in the paper that I'm about to publish and work I'm going to show you. I use a lot of new techniques, sort of pioneered somewhat in the UK to be able to understand precisely the points of commonality and the points of difference at a values level I wanted to talk to you about more about that in a second, but what I've been trying to understand is precisely what is the different sort of motivations of people who are entering the left and people who are exiting the left. This table that's in front of you right now lists the top, I think, 15 groups for each of people who are entering and people who are exiting the left. Each of these groups have more than 10% of electorate share. Any group that has, of the 52 demographics that I looked at, anyone that has less than 10% share, I've cut out for the purpose of this analysis, or at least for the purpose of this presentation. But this chart here summarises pretty much all the stuff I was showing you before and ranks them. So in terms of the number one people who are entering the left, it's 45 to 54-year-olds. Number one people who are leaving the left is Roman Catholics. I think that's relatively self-explanatory. What I've been wanting to understand is really, use here is what's called the values approach. That is to simply say, like, whereas traditionally we use things like demographies, geodemography, and attitudinal study to understand the extent to which a certain group is voting one way or another, the approach kind of suggests you need to go to a deeper layer, and that is you need to move much closer towards a voter's motivation to be able to understand precisely their behaviour. And therefore, what we kind of are rejecting is this view that there is voters automatons, so that is, they vote according to sort of how they're told, or social forces essentially mean that they don't really have any element of agency or any element of choice. We also sort of reject the alternative proposition in this paper, which is voters are perfectly rational beings who approach the act of voting the way in which they act. They approach a consumption choice. That is, they have perfect information and they have a perfect understanding of precisely what they want, and therefore are able to judge policies and be able to judge sort of offers and make a rational choice. Instead, we're asserting in this paper that voting is a social act, and it's like every other social act. It's undertaken with a mixture of sort of history, of a person's history, personal, family, community, emotion, and sort of reflects a person's individuals and the mix of morals and values. So what we've done here, and this is a technique which I'm going to show you the data for, is we've taken all the sort of various attitudinal questions that are a part of the Australian election study and sort of looked at the extent to which each of those questions goes back to a values map. We've used some of the work that's come out of the US in terms of the design of that values map. I'm more than happy to get into precisely who the academics were and what sort of work that was done, but you can read the paper where it's all covered. But this kind of goes back to that sort of Stephen Schwartz, for people who are sociologists amongst us, and sort of the World Values Survey and sort of work that's been done there as well. And then what we've done is essentially created a whole series of indexes that sort of measure the extent to where groups align on this values map. That is, to the extent to which they are motivated by hedonism, the extent to which they are motivated by optimism, the extent to which they are motivated by tradition, the extent to which they are motivated by morality. We then cross-reference where each group falls on the values map according to how the left performed within that group, comparing the 1993 to 2013 voters. But this is the thing which is important to remind. What I've done in this study is I've taken out every single right-wing voter from 2013. That is, what I'm about to show you is purely an analysis of left-wing voters, people who voted one Labor or one Green. No one else is in this. Therefore, what this is about is trying to show people the points of sort of value alignment within the left. It's not really left or versus right. It's sort of one segment of the left versus another segment of the left as well. So I'll skip that bit. I want to start straight away by talking now about optimism and pessimism. So we looked at again at about three questions that go towards the extent to which each of these voter groups are optimistic in their demeanour or pessimistic in their demeanour. And what I'm showing you each of these is the top 10, 5 of the rising groups and 5 of the exiting groups, to show you how they all align on the optimism versus pessimism chart. Now, to be very clear, so you guys can understand, you'll have to follow the screen. The x-axis here denotes the extent to which they are more optimistic or less optimistic than the typical left-wing voter. So the 0 here stands for the typical left-wing voter's level of optimism, And the distance between 0 and each of these groups tells you the extent to which that group is more optimistic or less optimistic than otherwise. The y-axis is showing you the extent to which they are entering or exiting the left. And obviously the bubble size shows you the extent to how large a voting group they actually are. What we're finding overwhelmingly here is people who are entering the left tend to be far more optimistic than people who are leaving. Working class tradies, Anglicans, these are amongst noticeably pessimistic compared to other people as well. Indeed, the average optimism of the rising groups, that is roughly all of them actually that I looked at, is 0.02, and the average optimism of the declining groups is minus 0.07, and the gap there is 0.1. And that kind of shows you that there is quite a noticeable difference in optimism and pessimism between people who are entering and people who are exiting the left. Just bear in mind the last one, the last chart here, which says, so the last number of the table here, which says distance between most optimistic and most pessimistic, that's 1.23. You don't really have to look too much for that number, but just keep that number as a comparator to the other three I'm about to show you the extent to which this sort of values tension is either the largest or the most important or the less important in terms of the left as well. I'll talk to you now about tradition and modernity. And obviously the extent to which people are open towards change, the extent to which they are prepared to welcome change, the extent to which they're prepared to sort of be threatened by change, and the extent to which they prefer traditional norms and the certainty that is provided is a thematic in politics always. And in general, you would think that the left, we usually are the political tradition that champions the future, and we are usually the political tradition that changes change. What is interesting is those who are joining the left are far more inclined towards a more modern outlook and are far more welcoming of change than those who are leaving. Those who are leaving do drive more element of comfort from tradition than those who are the typical left-wing voter. And indeed, if you look at the average, sorry I didn't change the labels on the table here, clearly it's loaded the wrong, may have loaded the earlier version, but that obviously is meant to be the average element of modernity for the rising groups and the average modernity for the declining groups. The difference is quite large, definitely compared to this one, where it's 0.1, here it's 0.32. And that's the average distance. There's quite a noticeable gap and difference in values disposition between those who are entering and those who are exiting the left as well. Having said that, the distance between the most traditional and the most modern is less than the distance between the most optimistic and the most pessimistic that I showed you earlier as well. Social liberalism and social conservatism. I don't necessarily think I have to spend a huge amount of time to sort of explaining this, but the 10-second summary of a hell of a lot of political theory is that sort of social liberalism tends to have a bias towards an individual's freedom and an individual's choice. Social conservative centre is sort of more concerned about how groups relate to each other and the sort of how the extent to which their relations are ordered, stable, and not necessarily prone to disruption. You're seeing a decent, but not necessarily a massive gap between a person's sort of the dispositions between social liberalism and social conservatism here. But the same pattern tends to exist, which is those who are entering the left tend to be far more liberal than those who are leaving the left. And the distance isn't necessarily the sharpest, but it is, again, noticeable as well. The final one here, and this one here I think is a bit perplexing, and probably of all of them contains the most implications for us, and because this is something which particularly those members of the movement who are more social democratic in their outlook are going to be the most surprised by, and that is the extent to which the left agrees that reward or invest with the group on the benefit of fairness is declining. A lot of the people who are now entering the left have a view that wealth ought to be vested more with individuals than with group than before, and that's quite noticeable. And you're seeing it in respect to sort of particularly postgraduates and higher educated, to be honest with you. Like, that's one of the labels you can't see that is sort of quite noticeable. And a lot, pretty much to the teeth, all the declining groups are far more disposed towards the view that says wealth should be distributed fairly, as opposed to wealth should be necessarily attributed to an individual. This is, again, there's an element of sharpness in these differences here that are worth sort of further studying, worth pondering. To be honest with you, that was the one that surprised me the most. I would have thought that the mantra of the left, that is generally fairness, would be a huge reason why people join. But I guess this kind of is the conclusion of it, is what you're seeing is the left in general is organising far more culturally than it used to, on the basis of cultural tension and cultural agreement, than it used to necessarily on the basis of class tensions or economic things. This is very similar to what's happening everywhere else. That is, in general, most sort of left-wing parties are starting to reflect cultural divisions far more than they used to reflect class divisions and economic divisions. I don't think personally necessarily talk through all that sort of stuff, but I certainly think that now we're in opposition at a national level and in opposition at many state levels, and we now very much face a real choice about how we rebuild, with whom do we rebuild, and what does rebuilding mean in respect to that sort of thing. The reason why I'm publishing this paper is because I kind of think that ought to be far more data-driven and with everybody having access to a common basis of fact, which is why I'm very grateful that you've all persisted in looking at my 45 slides, and I hope you will all be reading the paper.